Today we welcome voiceover artist Derrick McClain to the podcast. After 8 years of public speaking and live oral interpretation of literature, Derrick made the jump to voicing audiobooks. He describes himself as passionate about romance of all types, and so far has released 13 audiobooks since he began, including books by Josh Lanyon, Amber Kell, Andrew Gray, and others. His latest release is TJ Klune's How to Be a Normal Person, which he calls a career milestone for himself. Thanks for being here, Derrick.
Thanks for having me.
So tell us, what was your path towards becoming a voiceover artist for Dreamspinner?
Well, I'd always, sort of my whole life, I've always had something of an interest in voiceover acting and audiobooks in particular. As a kid, my mom and I used to half joke about one day potentially doing audiobooks together because we'd listen to them all the time. But I never had really any idea how to get into it. I didn't even know where to find the proper door to put my foot in. So it was always just kind of in the back of my mind as something that I liked the idea of, but had no idea how to actually do. And then life just kind of guides us sometimes. I ended up moving to Tallahassee for college, probably about 4 years ago, and never ended up really moving away. When I went to college, I started volunteering at my church as a youth pastor, essentially. After I graduated from college, I actually started working at church in the full role of youth ministry director. So what does that have to do with audiobooks? Well, three of our boys in the program, their mother actually used to be the youth director, a couple directors past, and I got to know her pretty well, and she stepped down from the position because she had started up a little publishing outfit, and it started taking off and doing really well. And her name is Elizabeth North, and the publishing outfit was Dreamspinner Press. So when I found myself needing a little bit of a supplement to my income, I asked her if she had any odd jobs I might be able to help out with. She connected me with Andrew Gray. I started proofing audiobooks for Dreamspinner, and it really just rekindled this that old thought and that old passion for narration, except now I knew how to get into it. So finally I went ahead and got a microphone and got set up and gave it a try, and that was a little over a year ago now, and this has become my full-time career.
So for the folks who are watching our video feed, they see you in your studio. Did this used to be a closet or some other small space?
Yes, this was a closet. And when I very first started out, I had just a little USB microphone. And this was an active closet. It had some clothes in the back, some blankets, and I had a few pieces of studio foam that I had put up for sound absorption, and that was my first sort of trial space. Can I actually make it through a book? Can I actually do this? And after the first couple contracts and the first couple successful releases, that's when I decided to go all in and had a massive remodel. And so now this is a full soundproof booth, tore out the walls, put in special insulation, double layer drywall with this green glue in between, and really just invested in it, got a professional microphone and got all set up so that I can really give the titles that I get to bring to life the best that they deserve.
Nice. So where did the passion for the romance novels come from?
Well, there's this big sort of misconception about romance that's out there. And it's this idea that romance is just basically porn for middle-aged housewives. And I know that that's a misconception because I'm ashamed to say I used to think that that's all that romance was. And I had never even considered opening up a romance novel until I started actually audio proofing for Dreamspinner. And I think the very first book that I did proofing for was Reese Ford's Sinner's Gin, which is narrated by Tristan James. and it was just extraordinary. It was nothing like what I expected. And since then, as I've, obviously read many more romance novels and narrated some that aren't gay romance as well, I've really come to appreciate it. And what you get in general fiction, you almost always have some kind of romantic subplot. And it's there in the background. It's not the main thing, but we follow it and we care about the characters and we want them to come together. And romance that's somewhat flipped. That romantic subplot becomes the main plot, and then the subplot is the detective mystery or the werewolves fighting for territory or the space pirates. But your main focus becomes on that romantic relationship. But one of the biggest things for me is that in fiction, when we have these romantic subplots, we don't really get the full picture because it's just the subplot. You don't get into the characters and you don't get into what they're really feeling. And when you always fade to black, you can miss some of the most pivotal moments in that. And so what I've found it to be is just incredibly compelling because you still have all of these exciting main storylines, but the focus is simply shifted on something that's actually more relatable. It's on that person's individual struggle to find and succeed at love. And so I don't know. I love it.
A hopeless romantic.
Yeah.
So you said that How to Be a Normal Person from T.J. Klune was a career milestone. Why is that?
Well, of course, first and foremost, TJ is a wonderfully brilliant and very well accomplished and appropriately loved author. And it's always great to be able to have the opportunity to narrate just really, really high quality works. But TJ was sort of extra special for me because when I was very first thinking about actually giving this a try, and his books, Tell Me It's Real, was the very first book that I ever attempted to record an audition for. And I sort of wrote about this at length on my blog, but basically, yeah, the short story is that it was the very first book that I ever tried to audition for. It was the absolute worst audition that I've ever recorded in my life. I spent hours just re-recording it, and it was miserable. And then sort of as things went going, that always sort of stuck with me. And I kept auditioning for every T.J. Klune book that came up. And it sort of naturally became this milestone for me because his books are highly sought after by narrators. And so to have that honor of narrating one of TJ's books really for me exemplified that where I've gotten to and inspires me for where I could be heading.
So towards that end, like what's the next milestone that you have your eye set on?
Next is probably honestly just a couple minor, almost boring milestones. There's so the way that, for those who don't know, for the audiobook productions of books by independent authors or small and niche publishers, there's this sort of marketplace. It's called the Audiobook Creation Exchange, or acx.com. And so independent audiobook narrators and producers like myself go on there and we look for books to audition for. And authors and publishers can post up titles open for auditions. And they have a status called Audible Approved for those narrators and producers who have produced a certain number of titles of a certain set quality. And I haven't yet gotten that little stamp of approval, partly just because of the quantity of books. I've been pretty selective about the books that I take. So that's really the next milestone for me, is getting that Audible approved stamp and just seeing where I go from there.
So what draws you to a book to audition?
First and foremost is just the financial. It's a business decision to start with. Books are obviously offered at a number of different rates, and payment options. And so because I do this full time, it can't all be passion projects. But once you sort of whittle that down, then for me, it's really trying to find the books that I feel are going to be a great match for me, for my voice and my narrative style. And of course, the more that it sounds like I would be interested in reading the book, the easier it becomes to really delve into it as a narrator. So the more I'm drawn to that. I'm absolutely miserable at most accents. So I tend to avoid books that take place in Australia or England or really anywhere other than just general US. I pass those along to Joel Leslie and Greg Tremblay. But yeah, and especially anything that's got real kind of that mix of tough guy characters, but also that vulnerability. I'm always kind of drawn to stories that have a real personal development arc in addition to that romantic connection arc.
Nice. Okay. So, is there something in some like general guidance that like makes a book good for audio as opposed to something that might not translate as well in your view?
I will say one thing that definitely does not translate well in audio that I haven't had to deal with, but I've heard of other narrators struggling with this, is in some mystery or detective style books, you might have one of the speakers being the murderer, being the person whose reveal is at the very end of the book, but you have their voice. And so titles like that, where there's supposed to be some kind of mystery, but the character is speaking, and so you can, in audio, it's very difficult to translate that in a way that doesn't just give it away right from the first chapter. But generally speaking, anything that's got a lot of that's dialogue driven, even if it's just internal dialogue, but it lends itself to that deeper characterization and where you really want to hear the characters and hear the full emotion beyond just the words that they're saying, but how they're saying those words and how those come across. Those are your gold winners.
Is a first person POV book easier than a third?
I generally prefer a deep third POV, because with that deep third, you still get a lot of that internal dialogue and a lot of those. You still get a lot of emotion. It's not this detached, omniscient narrator. Which even sidebar, even if it is detached, distant third-person narration, it's never appropriate to narrate a book absolutely monotone going through that. So even nonfiction books, you want to bring life to it, you want to bring meaning to it, you want to bring that proper inflection. The challenge sometimes with first person is that separating the exposition, the narrative, from the actual dialogue. So you end up having to basically create these two different character voices, one that's a little bit subdued, so that as a listener, you can tell the difference between, internal thoughts and spoken word. Because that can actually be a big challenge.
Okay. I guess the question that I kind of get to from that is, how did you learn to do this, if you will? Is it those years of listening to audiobooks with your mom, or just getting into it and going for it, or?
Oh, there's a number of things. So most audiobook narrators come from a background in acting. Most of them have had varying degrees of success and training in stage and screen acting, and they bring that experience and that skill set and that knowledge to audiobook narration. I went to theater camp once in middle school, and it was a musical, and so everybody who was at the theater camp had to was automatically in the play, but they had us sing Tomorrow. It was Annie Warbucks. And I got maybe 3 words into the song, and they all stopped me and said, that's enough. And I was given the only role in the entire play that didn't have to sing. And that kind of traumatized me from acting. But my background, I come from a public speaking, and in college I did forensics, which was a lot of, it's that oral interpretation of literature. It's kind of like reader's theater. And that gave me a set of starting baseline skills that I brought into it. But since then, I did some coaching with Sean Allen Pratt, who is very, very well accomplished and awarded audiobook narrator. Has been doing this professionally, has, I think, now over 800 titles to his name. And so I've done some private one-on-one coaching with him. But one of the other really awesome things about the narrator sort of life is the community that exists. And I think I at first expected it to be not a very friendly community, because we're out there and we're competing for titles. We're auditioning against each other. But in fact, it's a very, very supportive community. I think not dissimilar to probably author communities, where we have our sort of closed Facebook groups, and we're able to ask each other for advice and communicate about different things, and complain about certain things behind closed doors. And so sort of a mix of all those things, what I've already come up with, the coaching that I've been getting, and just having those connections has been hugely beneficial.
Okay, makes sense. So you mentioned the tough guy role when you were talking about, the things to voice. Do you have a favorite character type to portray?
My absolute favorite character type would probably really be someone who's a little bit awkward and a little bit insecure, and gets to grow through the process of that. And that's probably because that's closest to how I see myself. And it also allows a bit more variance in voicing. I do enjoy your more stoic, tough guys. They can be extra pleasurable sometimes to narrate, especially when they're being particularly sexy. But they can also be challenging sometimes, because once you get into that deep, rough, tough guy voice, it's really tough to then show this huge range of emotion. So sometimes I can have some pretty awkward takes with them.
What about characters that are difficult? You mentioned the accents being a thing, but
accents, yeah. I did. Josh Lanyon has a 2-novella set that's combined in audio that I did, Dark Horse, White Knight, and I didn't realize when I auditioned for it, because I generally avoid, if I see that there's major accents in an audition or it takes place in a foreign country, I'll kind of go, well, not for me. And in White Knight, one of the main characters is an actor, and they're filming in Wales. So not only is it an accent, but it's a Welsh accent. And Welsh accents are particularly challenging, and there's a huge range of them. And I remember I spent like 2 days just reviewing videos and accent books and talking to friends, and I recorded all these things and sent them to Josh, and finally just settled on very slight accent, and just said, please don't hate me for this. But yeah, so accents are challenging to me. Women are always an obvious sort of unique challenge, because obviously I don't sound like a woman. And what's important to remember for narrators voicing the opposite gender is that you're not going to sound exactly like that gender. And so you've got to avoid that obviously fake falsetto that will just disturb all the readers and all the listeners. And instead just, take a little softer and find that point that gives that hint. but it's still sometimes a challenge, particularly if there's multiple people who are all women or who all have accents and who all have very sort of similar voices, and trying to figure out how to give them all something unique so that they do stand out in the production.
Mm-hmm. Does that make big cast books in general more difficult?
Yes. Although generally it's a welcome difficulty. The biggest challenge is when you have a section where you have a group of characters who all have dialogue, and especially if it's, you've got 6 men who are all farmers, who are all between the age of 20 and 30, who are all from the same area, and have the same education level and the same background, and coming up with those, how do I make this character distinct to where the listener isn't confused about who's speaking without turning them into caricatures or making them otherwise sound inauthentic, or making a voice decision that's inauthentic to what's been described in the writing.
Mm-hmm. And I guess to that end too, what kind of, notes do you take, or preparation for having a character, who shows up in chapter 2 and then voicing him again in like chapter 25 to remember what he sounded like back there? Do you just re-listen that day to when that to remember where he was?
Well, there's 2 things with that, and one is that when I very first get the script for an audiobook, before I ever record a single line, I sit down and I'm reading through the entire book, and I keep notes, and I'll mark down every single character that has even a single word of dialogue, and then also record any all the sort of notes about their character, their personality. If there's any explicit description of their voice, of course I write that down, but also all the sort of character traits and background and history that then helps sort of inform those characterization choices. Then I finally learned that while I'm going through and recording a book, at the very first time that every character speaks, after I record their dialogue, I'll go back and I'll export just a small snippet of a line that they said, and I'll save that on my desktop with the character's name, so that then when they come up 25 chapters later, I'm not trying to scan through that previous chapter trying to find where they spoke. I can just listen to that clip, speak along with it, getting the voice accurate again, and then pick up from there. And that's been an invaluable tool in maintaining consistency.
Nice. So the question I'm sure all of our listeners have: are sex scenes awkward or difficult to narrate?
They can be. The most universal awkward thing with sex scenes is single word exclamations. I've had, finding the right way to say oh, like you gotta experiment and figure out exactly how to do it. And it can be sometimes that can be fun sometimes. But on a bigger level, a lot of people who are new to audiobook narration are very hesitant about books with sexual content, especially if they haven't read, if that's not the sort of books that they typically read. And for me, I generally don't find it particularly awkward or challenging. And part of it really goes back to what I love so much about romance, because again, when you have a romantic subplot in a general fiction book, they fade to black, and it's really almost this disservice to the reader, because in real life, sex is never just sex. There's always something more going on there, and it's an experience of incredible vulnerability, and it can be an experience of incredible connection. And in my life, in my relationships, oftentimes those first few sexual encounters really embody these turning points in those relationships. And you get the same thing in romance. In romance books, and for me, this is part of how I sort of differentiate between romance and erotica differently than most people, I think, do. Oftentimes I hear that, oh, well, the difference between romance and erotica is how much sex there is. Erotica is filled with sex, and romance, might have a couple sex scenes. And for me, it's more about not the quantity of the sex, but the quality and the nature of those sexual scenes. So in romance, there's always something more. There's always a purpose to that sexual content. And it can be as simple as in Eastern Cowboy by Andrew Gray, there's a masturbation scene. And it's a very sort of sexy, erotic, big, manly farmer guy taking care of himself. But what we see as we're going through that is his internal thought process. What we see is his starting out with his go-to fantasy, but then his mind wanders to this new guy that he's met. And there's something more there. And so in romance, I sort of embrace those sex scenes because there is more to tell and there is something more going on there. And it's when you don't have that, when you just fade to black, you can miss that. And so I really appreciate that. Erotica, on the other hand, will oftentimes just sort of be sex for sex sake. And sometimes that can get awkward for me because it is missing that something. It's missing that something else.
Okay. And that I understand the kind of designation you've got going on there. Makes a lot of sense. Did you ever think when you were a youth minister that you would end up doing this kind of work? I mean, I can't imagine that was on the career path.
Obviously, I mean, to keep in mind, I mean, Elizabeth was an active parent, and she was involved in a very similar position, and there was no sort of hiding about the publishing company and the content that it produced. A lot of people get really surprised and confused when I talk about church and gay romance in the same sentence. So obviously our church is a bit liberal about these things. But yeah, I mean, I was actually working towards becoming a minister. That's why I went to college, was to get the degree I needed before going to ministerial school. But just sort of through the course of life, I realized that ministry just wasn't really the right path for me, which was shocking to me because it's what I had been working towards for so long, and I'd spent a number of years traveling and speaking at different churches and youth retreats. And gay romance was almost this, and romance and audiobooks in general became this surprise safety net where all of a sudden I sort of had no idea what I was going to do with myself. And then this old dream came back, and it's just fallen into place.
So what's coming up next for you? What can your fans look for?
I'm searching for some things right now. I do have a couple ultra short titles that I decided to play around with. And then I'm currently speaking to an author who's based in New Zealand about taking some of her books into audio. She's been previously unable to do it because of ACX's contracts, but I'm working with another producer friend of mine who has a small publishing house. But I can't talk too much about that project just yet because it's in the works. But it is an MM gay romance shifter, and I will admit I enjoy my werewolves.
Okay, and I guess there's
fun.
a question we actually hadn't asked. You're talking about liking the werewolves. What do you like to read most in MM? And I won't put you on the spot like necessarily with authors per se, but in general, in terms of various tropes and such.
I do have fun with werewolves, which I wasn't originally expecting, but there's just something fun about that alpha male werewolf pursuing that gay relationship, and it more than any of the other tropes, it almost accentuates one of the other things that I love so much about gay romance, which is having these masculine, tough male heroes who are gay men. And as a gay man myself, it's really, really so wonderful to see these gay characters who aren't cliches, who aren't stereotypes, who there is this big diversity and this broad range of things, and so that's fun for me.
All right. So what's the best place that people can keep up with you online to find out what is coming next when you have announcements?
The best place is generally Facebook. That's where I spend way too much time. Although I am also on Twitter, and I try to keep up with my website. Pretty much all of it is Voice of Derrick. If you Google Voice of Derrick, DERRICK, you'll basically find most of my online presence. But I do tend to be very active on Facebook.
All right, very good. Anything else you want to tell the listeners before we let you get back to your recordings of the day?
Thanks for listening, and if you don't regularly listen to audiobooks already, give it a try. Nothing like being productive while you get to listen to a book, and just maximize your reading consumption.
So we often talk to authors about their writing process. What's your process to record a book? You mentioned a little bit about taking the notes and breaking down the characters and such.
Mm-hmm. So in addition to breaking down the characters, when I first sit down with that book, I also, in my little journal, I write down every single word, name, place that I have any doubt whatsoever about the pronunciation. And the more I keep doing this, the longer those lists tend to get, because the more I find out that there are these words that I've been mispronouncing my entire life and had no idea that I was mispronouncing them.
Such as?
Eschew. I always pronounce that askew, and that is, an alternate pronunciation. But I'm trying to remember some of the other specific ones right now.
I didn't put you on the spot with that one, so
I've blocked them out of my mind because I refuse to remember the bad pronunciations. But it definitely happens, and so now I'm just sort of anything that I think at all I could be mistaken about. And I've learned a lot over the last year about how to find proper pronunciations and what not to trust when it comes to proper pronunciations. There's a lot of YouTube videos and other websites that have text-to-speech. And ladies and gentlemen, the computer does not know how to properly pronounce things, so don't listen to those. But anyway, so I write down the character notes and I write down all the pronunciations, and I really pay attention to, it's really a deep reading of the text to really understand the subtext and to understand, what really matters, and to pick up on the foreshadowing, and so to be able to give that just the right amount of emphasis and focus. Then, of course, comes the recording, and that can be a process in and of itself. And I'll skip a lot of the technical stuff, but I do a particular type of recording process whereby if I make a mistake, I flounder on a word, I don't like a take, I go back and re-record over it right away. Sometimes narrators will just repeat the line and then have to go back in and pick their favorite line, and I found this helps me flow better. But even then, once you've finished that, then comes all of the editing and the processing and the formatting, and that'll sort of come down to the budget of the project. If the budget allows, I like to outsource all of the technical stuff to people who have been doing it for decades. And if the budget doesn't allow, then I get hands in and sort of a do-it-yourself editing process.
How long does a book take? I mean, let's use TJ's as an example.
Well, let's not do that because Derrick ran a bit behind schedule on that. So, in general, actual recording, the actual process of recording the book, it might take 2.5 hours per 1 hour of finished actual completed audio. And that's from different things such as just the basic warm-up process to doing multiple takes to going back and checking things. When you hit that one sentence that's an accidental tongue twister in the book and you just got to keep, and you finally plow through it, but then you listen to it and you're just overemphasizing every word. And so you've got to go back and do it again. But then there's also the time in initially reading through the book and taking those notes. And then of course the editing and production. And so when everything's said and done, it can easily take about 8 hours of actual work per finished hour of completed audio. And then on top of that, as far as an actual time frame, when you're setting deadlines and figuring out your production schedule, to be able to account for things like as much as I love my booth that I've set up, I still can't record through a thunderstorm. There's still certain weather conditions that will just cause extraneous noises that can't be taken out. And so I just fundamentally can't record. If I get a head cold, unless every single character and the narrator in the book have a head cold, I've got to stop recording. And so being able to anticipate delays like that can suddenly put that in, as well as just there's a natural constraint in how much you can record in a given day. Because after a while, you're just going to hit a certain degree of vocal fatigue. And if you try and push through that, then you end up with these very, very different sounding audio. And you might not notice it when you're listening to it and there's that gradual change. But when chapter 6 ends after I've been recording for 8 hours, and then the next day I start up with a fresh voice on chapter 7, it suddenly sounds dramatically different. Mm-hmm. And so you've got to be able to sort of plan for that and to allow for that extra time and not push yourself through it, because it can ultimately create this disservice to the final product.
How much collaboration is there with the author as you're going through?
That depends. It depends on the author and the circumstances. With independent authors, I tend to have a bit more direct communication with them, and sometimes they'll really want to make sure that certain character voices are spot on. But by and large, it's set up, and it works out best when the narrator really is their own creative director. And part of what we who do this outside of the big professional audio houses, just like an independent author has to wear all sorts of hats and take on multiple aspects of the writing, while a published author can just mostly focus on writing and then some marketing. We too have to wear all sorts of hats, and there's that engineer hat and there's that creative director hat. And so we get an understanding of what works in audio, of the choices that make the most sense, of what industry standards are. And part of our role sometimes becomes communicating that to the rights holder and communicating that to the author. And so to just be perfectly blunt, sometimes authors can try to micromanage, and that never ends well. So I tend to try and minimize that and be clear about expectations at the beginning. But again, that's not to say that there isn't that collaboration. And so to have that initial, most of it comes in the initial. In the audition, we also submit a first 15 minutes when we first get a contract, because sometimes the audition doesn't give a full demonstration of what the narration will sound like, or it won't include all the characters. And so that's where you have sort of the most back and forth. And then a lot of my collaboration often comes into play after the book's release, and with marketing and sharing that book out to the listeners and to the readers. And I really enjoy working with authors who are interested in collaborative marketing, and who are interested in doing, interviewing each other, or doing other sort of joint efforts. And that's always a blast.
Mm-hmm. Do things get changed in the actual text as you're recording because it just works better in audio?
Not very often with fiction. With nonfiction, it'll be changed more often, mostly just because, and it's just little things like with nonfiction books that refer to, you the reader as you read this. So changing that to you the listener as you listen to this. And also in nonfiction, you tend to get more sort of academic abbreviations that you will translate for audio. So i.e. becomes that is, e.g. becomes, for example, or such as, things like that. With fiction, there's usually not much reason to do it. Sometimes it can be tempting to change things around because it's easier for me to say. And other than a few, sometimes I'll have accidental contractions where they're not written in. So I might say I won't, or he isn't instead of he is not. But for the most part, I really try to strive to stay true to the text as it was written. And just as I don't particularly want authors telling me exactly how to narrate a book. It's not my place to tell authors exactly how they should have written it. So we do our best to stay true. It's only those things that absolutely don't translate, and most of that comes in with nonfiction.